Good morning, everyone. Hi there. Morning, everyone. Hola. Thank you for coming. So today we will have Will Feeney doing his talk. He's just arrived last week. He's Ramon y Cajal here with us now. He has his PhD from the Australian National University. And he has been wandering around for some years before he came here. So he has been working in the US, in Germany, and in England. And now he's come here apparently to stay. So thank you, Will.
Cool, thanks so much. So I just got here a few days ago. I don't know many of you guys, so when I was asked to talk, I figured it might be best to give a little bit of an introduction into the kind of stuff I do, the way that I approach research, and just a little bit of the stuff that I'm currently doing to hopefully find some common links with you guys and start working together. So I'm a behavioural ecologist. My work really focuses on understanding how species interactions operate, as well as the sort of broader consequences of them. I'm very question-driven in my approach, so I use a variety of marine and terrestrial study systems all around the world to follow questions on sort of conceptually similar lines. I was trained as sort of a classically trained evolutionary ecologist, I guess, so a lot of my work is focused on questions to do with the evolution of cooperation or deception. So, for example, in this study we did about a decade ago, we're looking at brood parasitism, which is a breeding system in which the parasite lays its egg, or usually in birds, but insects and all sorts of other things as well, lay their eggs in the nests of other animals and abandon the costs of parental care to the host. And so what we did in this study, we started with a field system that I have in Australia, and we're looking at the sort of coevolution of brood parasitism and cooperative breeding. And it's this really nice sort of system where you can basically just keep on like Lego blocks really, looking at one species, multiple species, a continent, multiple continents, and then right through to sort of a macroecological pattern of this global causal evolutionary association between these breeding systems. One of the things, though, that annoyed the living hell out of me with this study was that while we could show that there was, a causal relationship between these breeding systems, we couldn't really say anything about which direction. So is brood parasitism driving cooperation? Is cooperation driving or selecting brood parasitism? Is it sort of a combination of both? We couldn't really say. What I think is probably happening is that you've got like an extinction sort of filtering event or process happening where brood parasites that happen to colonise cooperative breeders are less likely to go extinct than those that aren't. So it sort of drives this pattern, but that's a study that's yet to be done. But either way, that sort of laid the foundation for this study that we did a few years later, sort of trying to understand this sort of global pattern of cooperation and brood parasitism. In this study, though, we did some work on anemone fishes, or the facultative anemone fishes over in French Polynesia. So you find these guys, facultative associations with anemones all over the world. One of the things I have found, or at least my impression with anemone fish relationships, is that everybody focuses on the Nemos because they're extraordinarily cute. And they don't go anywhere, so you can just always find them. But there's a whole bunch of fish that facultatively associate with anemones as well that have largely been ignored, which means that, when it comes to understanding the sort of basic benefits of these relationships, it was one of those things that was assumed, but you couldn't really find, aside from sort of taking an anemone fish, putting it on the sand and watching it get eaten, you couldn't really show that there was much of a benefit. So we sort of showed in this study that basically there's this enormous benefit, anti-predator benefit, particularly to smaller fish. There's this sort of well-recognised pattern that if you're a coral reef fish, predation is just rife. Coral reef fish get absolutely obliterated early in their life. Sort of 99% predation rates during sort of larval recruitment pulses. And what you find is that, once fish get above about 4 centimetres, they're pretty much in the clear, because fish, unlike a lot of other animals, they only eat what they can fit in their mouths. So what you find is that, from a single species through to like global patterns, if you run a comparative analysis looking at the body size of the fish and whether or not they've been reported to associate with anemones or not, if they're a fish that is an adult that is above about 4 centimetres and they've been reported to associate with anemones, they're only really associating them with them as juveniles, whereas small-bodied fishes that have been reported to associate with anemones associate with them throughout their lives. So it was a really nice extension of this study because we couldn't say which direction the relationship was going, and in this one we were able to say, yeah, predation is driving globally recurrent patterns of interspecies mutualisms, which at least the pitch that we made was that no one had really ever done that before, and I think that that's true. In the same way, I've looked at things like perception. So in this study, this was done in Zambia with Claire Spottiswoode. One of the things with brood parasitism is that you've got these relationships that a lot of the time, not always, but a lot of the time, are really deception-based information arms races, and everyone knows that cuckoo eggs really closely mimic host eggs, and more recently it's been found that chicks of different species mimic the chicks. The fledglings even mimic the fledglings, but no one had ever looked at an adult birds, and with these guys they diverged, I think it's something like 20 million years ago, but they look shockingly similar to one another. And we got some samples from the museum at Tring. We did some field experiments down in Zambia. And basically, yeah, it seems like the most sensible explanation is that these guys have evolved to closer resemble, morphologically resemble these guys because they're by definition, they're parasites, they're rare. And basically the cost of defending against them is greater than the risk, So that's some of the stuff. We've also followed that up with, again, aggressive mimicry, again in coral reef fish though. And basically with these guys, you've got these doddybacks, they're these little predatory coral reef fish. This was on the Great Barrier Reef. And it had been recognised for a long time that, you get yellow and brown ones, but no one really knew why. It sort of seemed to be the case that brown ones would turn yellow, and then, the papers are like, oh, that's around about enough. So we looked at this, and basically you've got this really nice system where you've got phenotypically plastic aggressive mimicry. So basically these doddybacks will hang out with these guys, so damselfish, which are just everywhere. All across the world's coral reefs, there are damselfish everywhere. So the yellow doddybacks hang out with yellow fish, the brown ones hang out with brown fish, and basically that gives them greater access to the baby yellow and brown fish, which are their food source. And in addition to sort of receiving this benefit of being able to increase their predatory success, it seems as though, they're also receiving a pretty big benefit of being the same colour as the prey because they're also vulnerable to bigger predators and they're more camouflaged in these different environments. And it takes around about, 5 to 10 days for these guys to go from a bright yellow fish to a dark brown fish and vice versa. So that sort of has been the kind of work. I mean, I'm still doing that kind of work. I'm really interested in that kind of, classic evolutionary ecology work. But one of the things that's really, that's one of the things I've become more interested in more recently is, using these interactions to try and explain the evolution of behaviours which are, a little bit, more fun, more sort of behaviour you see as uniquely human. Which, not really this, but they were the pictures I had on hand. More recently, I've been doing some work over in China with some of the guys over there, and you've got this really pretty system. I mean, everybody knows the sort of herbaceous plants being used in nesting material. That's also happening over here, but it's a very clear example where these sparrows will go and collect wormwood, they'll put them in their they'll sort of line their nests with it, and those that do that, the chicks have fewer parasites on them, the chicks also grow faster, so it seems to be a really clear example of, parasite-mediated or parasite selecting for sort of a tool use or herbaceous or wormwood using in their nests. And one of the really nice things about this particular system is that in the same area during the Dragon Boat Festival, the local people of the area in south-western China do the same sort of thing. So they'll hang wormwood around their doors, they'll bathe in it, all those sorts of things. So it's, it's just, I find it a little bit more fun to look at using these sort of classic predator-prey, parasite-host, eco-evolutionary processes to explain or try and help explain the evolution of behaviours which could be seen that way. Now, in the same way, more recently we've been doing some work looking at, again, predator-prey interactions on coral reefs, this time over in the Caribbean. So basically over there and all around the shop, you've got these systems where you've got these damselfishes. You know, damselfish are great, they just do everything. They're passerines of the sea. But what you get is a group of them, a fair few of them, about 70 species are farming, so they'll farm sort of these algae turf mats. And that's been recognised for a fair while, and there's been a decent amount of research on it. But one of the things that we found over there is that, you know, these are hyper-territorial fish. You know, they're about this big and they'll have absolutely no qualms attacking you or I or anything that goes near there. They're nothing but heart. And one of the things, though, is that they're really, really aggressive towards basically anything entering their territory, except for these, well, maybe other things, but at least notably excluding these clouds of mysid shrimps. And you've got this really pretty system where you've got these fish that are defending this territory that these mysid shrimps hang out in. By hanging out in these territories, the shrimps receive an enormous anti-predator benefit, but then the shrimps basically will hang out in the farm during the day. They're kind of like sea monkeys, but they'll hang out in the farm during the day, they'll go off into the water column to feed at night, they'll come back into the same farms during the day, and they basically spend all day defecating on the algae turf, which increases the quality and diversity of the turf algae within the farms, which then fish that have farms that have shrimps are in better body condition than those without. And, you know, one of the things we were trying to figure out, you know, what kind of a mutualism, you know, how to really sort of define it. And we came across some of the anthropological literature and sort of the definition that people have used for something like domestication. And the relationship that you've got here really closely resembles the idea of domestication by niche construction, which I don't really understand how ecologists haven't really, because, you know, niche construction's our game, right? And so we, you know, it was, well, firstly, it was the first example of domestication in a non-human vertebrate. I mean, we did get some criticism on this because we didn't show any evidence of a genetic change or whatever, and we sort of made the counter-argument like, yeah, well, the first wolves that hung out with people, there wouldn't have yet been a genetic change. It's not that there isn't one, we just haven't looked for it yet. But as far as a behavioural process that could underpin something like this, it certainly seems to be the case, and a lot of the anthropologists, well, not a lot, it's very split. But in addition to being the first example of domestication in a non-human vertebrate, one of the nice things about this is that you've got these three sort of very well-defined pathways or proposed pathways to domestication evolution when you look at the anthropological and archaeological literature as far as I understand. And this provides the first evidence, the first experimental evidence, because, you know, with humans it happened in the past, you can't really do it that way, but with this system and with the ants, you know, it seems to kind of be, because, you know, they sort of domesticate fungi, but it's sort of a climate change driven thing, which is, there's a lot of awesome work, but it's hard to sort of do the experiments, I guess. At least that's what I would argue. And yeah, so I would, you know, so we sort of found evidence of experimental evidence in support of this. So I think, let's just see if this works. So I'll just give a little example of the kind of, they're beautiful, like these fish are beautiful to work on because, you know, there'll be one here, there'll be one there, they're just everywhere. But also, things just happen so quickly on coral reefs. So this is just outside of a farm. So I think that the other video that I'll show you next was happening just here. So this was about a metre outside of a farm. These are little juvenile bluehead wrasse. You know, you've got a bag with a weight and some mysid shrimps in it. I don't know. You might be able to see them. Like you can see one there. You know, we've got I think, oh yeah, there's a whole bunch of them down there. I think there's about 150 per bag. But these were the sort of results that you would get. You know, they're just trying to get at them, right? They're all about it. Whereas so this is, yeah, so you can see here's this coral just here, so it's just around the corner here. Here's this, so the little fish, I think he's somewhere down here, but, you know, the same fish are all there, and this is the kind of result. So, you know, they'll come in, they'll have a look, you can definitely see all the mysid shrimps in there, and they just don't let anything into their farms. So this really sort of beautiful system for looking at these kinds of behaviours. So I guess one of the things that has sort of happened, or I've been thinking about over the past couple of years, is that all of these systems, and I mean, I guess a lot of sort of, at least the people that I hang out with who are sort of doing behavioural ecology in this way, we tend to focus on simple systems. So, like I study brood parasite host coevolution. And that's great because they are very pretty simple ways to look at things, and it works, right? Like you can glean globally generalizable patterns from these very discrete, simple pairwise interactions. But, of course, the world isn't anything like that. You'll have one parasite, one host, and that might be how we look at it at the moment. But really, in a lot of areas, you'll have multiple parasites and multiple hosts, and it's just a mess. And so that's one of the things that we've started looking at. I mean, one of probably the stupidest things I've ever done is started up a field site to try and look at parasite-host interactions in a multi-species scenario, because it just means that it's a logistics game at that point when you're trying to manage. And I'll get onto that later, how basically trying to manage for all intents and purposes, 3 or 4 field seasons in one with the sort of people and all this needed to do that means that ecology becomes a data management problem. But we started looking at this. One of the things we did with this was we compiled a list of all of the world's brood parasites, all of the world's hosts. So this was like a data-driven review, I guess. But all the world's parasites, all the world's hosts of brood parasites, looked at sort of the interaction networks between them, and basically what you find is that, of course, it's really heterogeneous all around the world. You've got hotspots over here in sub-Saharan Africa, throughout, really around the Himalayas, and then especially on the east coast of Australia. It's interesting because most of the world's about half of the world's 100 species of brood parasites are here, but I guess it's because you've got what the cuckoos, you've got the honey guides, and you've got the finches here. So you've sort of got segregation according to host compatibility, I guess. Whereas here, it's all one lineage of brood parasites. And I mean, probably here, I would imagine that this would come up bright purple if you had good data, but, there aren't many of us working over there, and it's very difficult. And, there are species there that we don't even know what they parasitize. But then one of the interesting things is that we then went through all of these studies looking at brood parasite-host interactions over about the past 100 years. So I think it was about 2,500 studies or something like that. And, you've got these hotspots here, a little bit over here. And if you look at sort of research effort over the past period of time, it's basically a mirror image. So it's one of those things where it's pretty easy to call brood parasite-host systems a classic system for studying coevolution when you look in the most simple areas in the world, I guess. And, I guess that sort of leads into, what happens if you look at these sort of interactions in more of a multi-species context, right? So, for example, the fairy wrens that I've been studying for a bunch of time in Australia, one of the things that they do is they produce a functionally referential vocalization that denotes, very specifically a cuckoo, and basically acts to rally in a whole bunch of birds to really attack the living hell out of them. And, you've got your regular mobbing calls that everything makes, which everyone kind of knows what they sound like, and I also don't have a recording on hand. But then what these guys do is they produce this sort of whining alarm call when they see a cuckoo. And that sounds a bit more like, and when you hear that, you know that there's a cuckoo nearby, and these things will go absolutely mental to the extent that you can put out a model cuckoo. These things will be on top of it, trying to pull the eyes out, trying to pull the feathers out of the back of the head. You've got to basically protect the models, and you can go and pick, if they'll try and bury under, but if you pick up the model, they'll still be on top of it, attacking it while they're in your hand, and then they'll sort of realise and fly off. But one of the things, so I've been doing these experiments for years, these different model experiments to sort of get an idea of how these birds react to different threat types and whatever, because, it's all about recognition and whatever. And one of the things that you kept on hearing, so say when I was doing this work in Australia, and then I went over and did some in Zambia, and with prinias, and, I was sitting in the hide. Granted, it was about, 30-something degrees in a hide. I was just half delirious. But, you'd hear these birds reacting and you're going, I swear they sound like fairy wrens. And then, when I was doing work on scrub wrens, you're like, I swear that's sounding, and then I was at a conference, like this study has been in the works for ages, so I was talking to a mate, Dave Wheatcroft, who's at Stockholm University now, but we were talking at that ISB in Lund like a decade ago, and I was like, I swear these birds are sounding the same, and he was like, oh, does it sound like this? And pulled out his phone and he had some birds from India and it sounded exactly the same. And so, so I've been doing these experiments on multiple species and, I'll go into this study in a little bit more depth because it's stuff that we're hoping that the last analysis will be done in the next few days. But, if you look at the number of whining calls in the superbs and the scrub wrens, so, these are malurids, these are acanthisids. These guys in Australia are parasitised primarily by the Horsfield's bronze cuckoo. These guys by the fantail cuckoo, which are two different genera of cuckoos. The number of whining calls, it's significantly more to the cuckoo in both cases than the other kinds of threats. The time mobbing, which is basically the time on the cage trying to, by at least one group member, try and get this thing way higher. And one of the other things that's really interesting that, you noticed in the past but not enough to really do much about it, was that the number of heterospecific individuals that would show up during this 5-minute trial was also significantly higher when this particular vocalisation was produced by both species towards their respective cuckoos than the other. So, you've got a control, a currawong, which is a generalist predator, a raptor, which is more of a predator of adult birds, and a snake, which is more of a predator exclusively of the nest. When you do playbacks, you get the same results. So you get the number of con and heterospecifics. It's more for both of them than the other kind. So these aren't super different results, but this is over a 30-second period when at least one bird is within a couple of metres anyway. So to give a little bit of an example, so this is just, the cage protecting the thing. The cuckoo is, around about there, and you'll see the fairy wrens come in and you can tell when they realise. So hopefully you can hear. And they'll keep on doing that basically until they get exhausted. And you sort of hear them winding down. They're like, so the question is then, well, what's going on? So what we did was we then sort of did point counts at all of the places that we'd done these experiments and looked at whether or not, what species were showing up during these trials. And basically, because the thing is, right, does this call function to attract the attention of absolutely everything in the area, or only things that are, or alternatively, maybe only things that are more relevant, like potential hosts of cuckoos, like passerines? Because a lot of the cuckoos in Australia are very generalist. While they'll have preferred hosts, they'll also go for whatever's going. And what you find is that potential hosts like passerines were significantly more likely to be attracted to these experiments than non-passerines. So, that's, granted not as many, but, it's natural history data. What can you do? So then I started going through online media databases like Xenocanto or at the Macaulay Library over in Cornell to pull out examples, just try and get any recordings of hosts responding to brood parasites. Didn't matter what, but and we had criteria like it had to be this kind and it had to be towards a predator and a whatever and all of these sort of things. And basically what we found is that of the 26 species we could get good data for, which span 9 families, we found that 22 had a unique vocalisation towards cuckoo, which is towards a brood parasite rather, which is a lot more than the 2 that are currently recognised at the moment, so the superb ferret and the yellow warbler over in the US. And Canada, or North America. And all but 2 of them looked shockingly similar, despite the species being phylogenetically and geographically disparate. So, said another way, this is, round about what it looks like. So, this is this call that they're making towards brood parasites, and it looks and sounds very similar, whereas this is sort of their more standard mobbing vocalisation. One of the really interesting, so this spans birds that span about 50-ish million years of shared ancestry, or of separation. One of the really interesting things is that our analysis, so you've got the yellow warbler here, which it's recognised that these guys have this seat call, which, unlike this sort of whining call, which seems to attract birds into attack the hell out of the cuckoo and just facilitate information use. This call, when these yellow warblers hear it, they rush straight back to their nest and they sit on it as tight as they can. And then you've also got a similar-ish result for the mockingbirds here, but these two had unique calls towards brood parasites, or at least that's how it came out in our analyses, but they clustered more with anti-predator calls, and this is really interesting because all of these guys, so you've got cisticoids, you've got old world warblers, you've got malurids, acanthisids, honeyeaters, fantails. One of the things is that in common with all of these guys is that the brood parasites that parasitize them, it's basically a zero-sum information arms race where if you get parasitized successfully, your entire brood is dead. Next question. Like the cuckoo will either eject your chicks or whatever. There's no salvaging your own. It's better to abandon the nest than to raise any possibility, right? Whereas these guys, the cowbirds, are much less virulent, and it's all about sort of basically trying to minimise the likelihood of the cowbird getting in the nest. But you do get these sort of mafioso standover strategies in the cowbirds because, you do salvage some of your own brood. So, if you don't accept an egg, they'll just come and destroy your nest. So you have to re-nest and they'll keep on doing it until you do. So these guys, it's really well recognised that in these deception-based arms races where information is key, and if you can learn about the presence of a cuckoo or a cuckoo, these guys are parasitized by cuckoo finches, so it's a totally different lineage of brood parasitism, but again, it's this sort of zero-sum game. They've convergently evolved this call, which seems, at least in the fairer ends, to facilitate a really rapid sort of transmission of information and cooperative defences. So the question is well, what the hell's going on? Why is this? So, this is the stuff that we did in that previous review, looking at the global distribution of the networks of parasite-host interactions. And, because we were looking at this data and it's like, well, it needs something, it's not there. And one of the most beautiful things I think that I've seen is when my PhD student, we then went and we did sort of a comparative. We went and pulled out all model presentation experiments that we could find. So, we had search terms and whatever. And basically, if there was evidence, because a lot of the times, one of the things that's extremely annoying is that people will often not publish the vocalizations that these birds will make. Even to get the yellow warbler call, it's been talked about for 20, 30 years, and we had to approach the authors can we actually see what it looks like? Can we get a recording of it? People don't tend to, but they do publish the results of model presentation experiments. So you can sort of, I think, half reasonably go, if they say if there's a predator, a parasite, and a control, if there's an obviously unique call being made towards the parasite, they're probably going to note it. They'll go, well, So if that wasn't noted, we report it we classed it as no evidence of a unique call, and if there was, it was, right? And so we pulled out that, and one of the things that you find is that these guys in green, actually, we're still in the process of doing this. Flip the yellow and the green. So all these guys in green don't have a unique call towards brood parasites. The ones in red, forget about this. The ones in red produce this seat call, this purple guy down here, that's the mockingbird. And then the ones in blue are the ones that produce this whining call. So, you've got these guys down in sub-Saharan Africa, these guys throughout Asia and the Himalayas, and then these guys. So it's the thing that best predicts the global distribution of this call, which seems to facilitate within and between species communication and cooperative defences and information transmission, is the density of the parasite-host networks in which the recording was made, which was super cool. So if anything, it seems and that better predicts it than the cooperative breeding status of the bird. So it seems like heterospecific cooperation is the best predictor of the global distribution of a convergently evolved or not diverged alarm call. We've been... So then the question is, righto, so do other species recognise each other's calls? And so we did some work, I did some field work in Australia and with some collaborators over in China. We had the superbs and the scrub wrens over in Australia. We had the common tailor birds and the rufescent prinias over in China, because we know that these calls, one of the other nice things was a collaborator in China wanted to work together. I was like, oh, you don't happen to have any recordings of these guys responding to a cuckoo, do you? They're like, yeah, don't worry about it. Sent me a bunch of videos, spot on, which was delightful. So we went over, we did experiments where we played calls of Australian birds to Chinese birds to Australian birds, all the different iterations. And basically what you find is that these, when presented with a call from their own species, a heterospecific sympatric species or a heterospecific allopatric, and in allopatric we mean Australia and China and Australia, parasitised by totally different cuckoos. These birds never come in contact with one another, or at least haven't for a very long time. They respond equally to each other's calls, and I think there's that very annoying one there. And the heterospecific sort of consequences are also exactly the same. So basically, these birds are producing the same sort of calls in the same sort of context and responding similarly, and the surrounding community is responding similarly. Brilliant. So, it's sort of, one of the things then is like, well, do we present this as an animal communication study? Like, what the hell do we do here? So I was talking to a mate at Harvard who's a linguist. He's a computational linguist. And I was like, oh yeah, what do you reckon? And we were talking about, like, what is a word? Like, when it really comes down to it, what is a word? Because, there's this huge debate about whether animals have words, linguistics and animal communication and all of this. And I think that impersonally, I think that one of the problems is that the definition of a word could be better, because basically it comes down to, my understanding is that it has to be a socially learned, functionally referential vocalization, and also linguists, in my understanding, would tend to say that there has to be an arbitrary association between the sound and the meaning. So, that's why, the word orange has no intrinsic link to what an orange is. There have been entire reviews written within the past decade saying, well, one of the things about animal communication, and this is not written by animal communication people, but still, is that vocalizations in animals are hardwired, tend to be hardwired, while in humans they're learned. So it's this sort of very different thing that we definitely shouldn't talk about together. And one of the things is that, when you look at these two assumptions, or these two sort of criteria, it's been, like, there was a study published in 2018 in Current Biology which made the claim that they had found the first example of a socially learned, functionally referential vocalization in any non-human species, and it was in chimps, which was kind of annoying because we did in 2013 in our birds, and there are also the guys over in Bristol who have shown that dolphins have names for one another. So this assumption isn't quite that animals don't have socially learned, functionally referential vocalizations isn't quite right. And the whole idea of there needing to be an arbitrary association between their sound and their meaning, I think when you look at the linguistics literature, you go, okay, cool, onomatopoeia, and they'll go, oh yeah, but that's an exception. And you go, like, okay, righto. So this mate of mine, Damien, he did this beautiful study where he looked at thousands of words from hundreds of languages, and what you find is that, this arbitrary association isn't actually a set-in-stone rule. And even more beautifully, really basic sort of communicatory concepts. So, mum, or the concept of round. Round tends to have an R sound in it. Mum tends to sound the same across languages. It's these really basic things tend to sound the same regardless of language, and then, the other stuff doesn't. And it tends to drift through time. But either way, it's not this sort of set-in-stone thing that people sort of argue that it is. And that's then really nice because you've got this, basically if you've got human language and, like, in terms of words, and animal communication systems, it's like, okay, well, if these are socially learned and arbitrary, for argument's sake, and these are fixed and innate, what we really need to be looking for here is something that sits in, a linguistic missing link, something that has that is learned for its production but elicits an innate response, or innate for its production but elicits a learned response. Because if you can find that, then it's like, well, here we go. And that's basically exactly what we've found in these birds. So, we know from our past work that if you present these fairy wrens with a model cuckoo that have never... So one of the nice things about fairy wrens is that they're a resident species, the cuckoos are migratory, and what we've shown in the past is that babies that hatch after the cuckoo leaves, if you show them a cuckoo during the breeding season before the cuckoos show up, because cuckoos show up, a little bit into the breeding season, they don't respond. But if they get a chance to watch their group members or whoever respond, they very quickly respond. So, you've got this situation. So that's basically how we're going to be sort of talking about this, is like, well, actually, it seems like, in theory, this is what the most primitive word should have. The attributes of the most theoretically primitive word or primitive thing that could be classified as a word in the same way that a concept like round should contain these characteristics. We've found that. We've not only found that, but it's globally sort of selected, basically that natural selection is selecting for these kinds of things. So, that's kind of what I just said. So I think I have a few more minutes left, and if you guys aren't bored, I was going to end it there if it was done, but if you wanted, one of the things that I see a really clear link with, or potential link with some of the stuff going on here is, because we've had these projects that are long-term monitoring projects that, the data, I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but for me, when, say at our field site in Australia, we'll have myself, we'll have the guys at Cornell, we'll have the guys at Cambridge all working on these same birds, and then we'll have the banders, and then we're collecting banding data, but also nest data, and birds are in social groups, but they also have nests, and we also want climate data. It just becomes an Excel nightmare, which, because then some people have some people have others, it's a nightmare. So one of the things, we've been doing over the last year is basically building a platform that can accommodate these kinds of data, and luckily my brother-in-law is a database architect, because I'm not, and I'm definitely not. And also one of the things that, it's really interesting sort of becoming a little bit a part of that world, because I have no idea how things work here, but I've watched people go like, oh yeah, cool, well, we'll just hire a postdoc to build our database. And you're like, oh, no, databases are their own thing. They all suck. You've got to play, their game, or you've got to speak that language. So basically, this is something that we've done. It's extremely adaptable. So this is just sort of like the homepage, and because we're also working with citizen scientists, they can also use this. It can be done with an app, all these sort of things. So, this is just a really, and at the moment it's not pretty because we don't need it to be pretty yet. We need it to work, and it does work. So, you have multiple projects. You can have as many as you want. It just gives some summary. One of the things, I don't know about you guys, but if anyone runs long-term monitoring projects where you're working with animals that may or may not be banded, well, especially if they're banded, if you've got 5, 10 guys out there monitoring these birds, if anyone has any tips on how to get guys to regularly record location data and put it into a data set, that'd be great. Because I've always found that people go, yeah, we'll do it, never gets done, because otherwise you're just writing down GPS points, it's a total pain, all this sort of thing. So, here you can tell when, now we enter all our data from an app, and I'll show you a video of sort of a data entry thing, and this light blue line is sort of reciting events. So, the amount of data that we're able to collect, it's up higher than this, it's just that we hadn't entered it all at the moment. Number of events, number of nests, all that sort of thing. So that's the home page. We've got it so that it all can be entered by a phone. So this was me actually entering data in the field. So, we've got 3 projects. So this is at Border Ranges, which is on the sort of border of Queensland and New South Wales in Australia. It's this ancient forest. Barra, which is out in western Queensland, so super arid zone, and then Samsonvale, which is where we've been doing a lot of our work. And basically the way that it works, so, this is just on the phone recording, so Samson Vale. One of the nice things is that you can't misspell. So you put in a species list, because I don't know if any of you guys do these things. So, it defaults to when and where you are, and that's a reciting event entered. It takes about 20 seconds, but just reciting here, add banding event. If you want, you could then click on details or related and add photos of the birds or the legs of the birds if you want colour bands on them, or the nests if you're monitoring nests, all these sort of things. But one of the nice things is that, like I've found, is that if data is collected in Excel, I'm yet to meet somebody whose data set isn't an absolute nightmare full of, we've got genus species here, we've got like the first letter of genus dot species, we've got yes, no, we've got 1, 0, we've got maybe, who cares, like we've got full stops in the middle of words, we've got characters that don't even exist on keyboards, all these sorts of things. And so what we've done is that it's just a process of reducing the likelihood or the opportunity for people to stuff things up, because at least my guys, including myself, suck. So that you can't put in the wrong species. There's a defined number of species for any given project that can be whatever you want. It can be an official list, it can be a made-up list, who cares? You can't put other species in. You can enter data from a phone, but at the same time, if there's a lot of Excel data, for example, we've built in a data validation tool, so there's like here, and we can totally customize. So because we're working with a few different people, you can customize the tools the rules. So it's like, okay, 1 and 0 isn't acceptable, and so is yes and no, and so is y and n, but maybe isn't. And then if you put that in, it'll say when and where it works. When it doesn't work, you can then separate it or like sort it by just the ones that don't work. You can fix them in there, or you can just fix the whole thing if the dates are all nonsense. And then, straight in the system, it just gives you some nice sort of exploration tools. So if you want to sort by species, oh cool, so how many tawny grass birds have we caught between these dates? Great, these are the locations. Caught 153 of them. The furthest travelled is 700 metres, and the oldest is 1,455 days old. If you want to sort it by species, this is everywhere that this guy's ever been banded. Caught 9 times over a 7-year period. So one of our fairies is now 13 years old. Also, birds can be a part of social groups, so that then you can have social groups that then a minimum convex polygon is automatically generated. The nests are in blue, which this is really nice because then it links straight through to any base, we can just link it with base layers that people want, or ARC's own base layers, so that then it's like, great, this is where these birds live. You can also, because a lot of the time if people don't enter it, you can also just draw it and go, well, actually it goes up here, and then you can have the automatically generated one versus the drawn one, and it's like, well, whatever. But you can then just go, great, here's the base layer, here are the nests, here's the success rate of the nests, here's the sort of status of the group, whatever. And then once data gets in, it's all validated, which then just makes it really, really easy to take out whatever data you want. So for example, here are the columns that we've chosen. You just click here and it'll give you access to whichever columns you want to add. So say here we've got species, band number, the colour band combination, the date, time, the age of the bird, the sex, the lat long, the wing tail, total head, tarsus, and weight measurements for them. And that's all there. It all works. So that means for students, it's like, oh, brilliant, you want to work on climate change? Cool. Here's 10,000 birds to work with, or whatever. It also means that you can sort of bring, at least in Australia, for example, you'll have citizen scientists that are collecting banding data, and it's like, that's all well and good. It's all kept on your own personal computer, and if you get hit by a bus, where's that data? It's just gone. And also you can filter by whatever you want. And so with that, thanks so much.
Thank you, Will. It is now 1:45, so whoever want to start?
Okay, I will start. So, I was wondering about your example with the domestication and the damselflies and the shrimps. How do you define domestic? I mean, because normally domestic is considered that when one species has control over the feeding of the other one, and that produces some sort of isolation. But that is just a habitat modifier. I mean, would be like beavers are domesticating fish because they provide an environment that would facilitate. How do you define domestication in this context?
So the definition that we went with is by Zeta in a paper she published in 2015 in PNAS. It's been cited about 700 times, so for us that's good enough. And she also really liked the study, which was handy. But her definition was, and I think the name of the paper was "What is Domestication?" But she defined the most basic form of domestication as the protection of one species in exchange for a predictable supply of a resource, which, you know, she's an anthropologist defining it like that, and you say going like, a lot of things look like that as far as an ecologist is concerned, because then it can be, you know, so that's sort of the most basic instance that she would consider domestication. Then there can be evidence of a genetic change, like there also has to be sort of evidence of custodianship or sort of protection that spans across species. And that was one of the things that we found with these shrimp was that, you know, we were surveying them for, I can't remember, a 30-day period or something like that, which is about 3 times the lifespan of these shrimps. And you were consistently seeing, like, you know, because, you know, they're this big, so we weren't able to track individuals, but you were consistently seeing different life stage shrimps in the thing. So as the most basic definition, we were like, well, this is, like, we can't see how this can't be considered a behavioural mechanism by which a more complicated domestic-tree partnership could evolve. If you wanted to look for that, you know, then you have to be looking for evidence of a morphological or genetic change as a result of these relationships. But I've just had a pre-submission accepted to write a perspective article sort of exploring that from a ecological point of view, because that's one of the things that my personal opinion is that one of the interesting things about these fields that focus on humans is that they tend to create definitions without considering what that might mean for other species, because it's like, well, if you want evidence, you know, and they'll go, well, you know, for example, I don't know if this is the case, but I'll look into it more, but it's like, well, we want to, you know, you've got to find evidence of genetic change, and you're like, well, I don't know, but what about a fish and then like, you know, it's like, with that definition, that looks like a lot of protection mutualisms, and there are plenty of protection mutualisms out there. What about fishes and anemones? Because not only do you have evidence of a genetic change, but you have co-speciation happening. Like, what, like, you know, and you know, it is kind of poking fun, right? But it's like, I also think personally that I personally think that the bigger, like, you've got these fields, and it took 8 journals to get that paper in, and it was one of the most interesting experiences because no one criticised the science, but I've never written more, most of the letters I've ever written to editors were in response to reviews on that paper, because you're going, come on, like, this clearly isn't this us proposing that this is happening in this species is very, very clearly eliciting an emotional response that has absolutely no bearing on the science. And like, I gave a talk the other day where, you know, we had the same thing for the medicine use thing. Like, I gave a talk the other day where, you know, I was like, well, this alarm call, argue that it isn't a word. You know, like, I'd love to hear how it isn't, because as far as I can tell, there's no way you can say that this isn't what a primitive word should look like. And, like, I personally think that it's really not, you know, you just sort of sit there and go, like, what are we doing here, guys? Like, are we looking to explain the evolution of behaviour while very consciously making sure that the sanctity of humans is maintained? Or are we trying to understand, we're using your definitions, so I find all of that stuff really interesting, but that's the underlying definition of domestication we use.
I really like your reasoning, and I completely agree. Mendes is the number one archaeologist in this, and the thing is that she had been working with goats, and I think so. And basically, she identified domestication in the archaeological remain by looking at the proportion of juveniles found in the remains, and that was what was suggesting there was one species, humans, having control over the goats, But I think that something inherent in that is some isolation from other populations of goats. So the control, and this is something that maybe you don't have. No, but I agree with you also, the emotional response. I work in domestication, and it's something, I don't think that's what I understand, but I understand that it's something that can be discussed, and I think it's a great example.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things, because we were getting pushback on that point. It's like, we're not saying that this is a full-fledged, this isn't the same as humans and horses, but if you were an alien looking at Earth and looking at the first wolf hanging out with the first people, or the first shrimps hanging out with the first fish, how would you see that behavioural process as different? And that's the argument that we were making.
Thanks for the talk, Will. It's really fascinating. So my question will be, you define the word as a vocalization, right? Mm-hmm. But using your own argument, how do you make a difference between vocal and non-vocal communication systems? I just thinking about something like fish chiromons, right? When the white or bait fish getting attacked by a predator, chiromons getting released from the epithelium and scaring heterospecific fishes in the pond. So I'm just wondering, I'm woefully under-equipped to talk about behavior of living animals, being a paleontologist. But are there any other examples of semantically defined heterospecific word signaling?
So I think it's a really, really interesting paper, because not exactly on your point, but kind of on your point. One of the things about this particular study is that if we were to write it up as a brood parasitism study, the pitch is really straightforward. But personally, I think it's more valuable to feed my soul that you write it up in where it's no, we want to intentionally try and do interdisciplinary work and see how that goes. I think that one of the really sort of nuanced thing about the argument that we're trying to make with this paper is we're not making the argument this is the first example of a word. We're sort of going, okay, cool, so there's these other studies which have not been acknowledged in this way, but clearly, if dolphins have names for each other, if that, clearly. But I do think that when it comes to other examples, and especially of heterospecific stuff, I wouldn't really be comfortable. I think that my experience, I think it's been a really interesting journey for me trying to do work like this, because in the domestication and the medicine use stuff, it was a bunch of ecologists trying to sort of dip our toes into other fields. I think that is a very stupid way to do. In hindsight, I've learnt that maybe isn't the best way to do interdisciplinary work. I think that you've really got to engage with people from those fields to produce something, because otherwise you're just there going hey, we're coming into your house and telling you what to do. It's well, actually it's a little bit more sort of nuanced and political and sort of stuff like that, where you've got to try and bring people on board. And one of the other things is that I think that when you're trying to do work like this, you do get these in my experience so far, you do get these I think as like ecologists, we're very not sentimental, whereas I feel like some other fields might be a little bit sentimental, and it's like, but on the proviso that humans are this, what do other things do? And I think that with that in mind, you've got to be very, very careful about the thoroughness that you do a study and make sure that, like, you know, for example, Alex Vale, one of my best mates, he did that beautiful work, I don't know, a decade ago or whatever, on the fishes and the eels, you know, the cooperative hunting between the fishes and the eels, and, you know, it was in Blue Planet 2 and all this sort of stuff. His paper, so I saw the draft of that when he was showing he was arguing intentional gesturing in a fish. That paper got rejected, I won't say from what journal, but a very, very, very good journal, because one of the reviewers said, that can't be pointing because fish don't have hands. Like, you know, I've had work on personality rejected going, it can't be personality because it's not a person. Like, you know, it's really sort of tricky. And so you've got to, I think that there are probably, almost certainly, a whole bunch of really, really good examples, but that means nothing unless you really intentionally go out to make sure that you tick off, like, you know, we've been sitting on this result for, like, I started collecting data on that a decade ago, and it's like, we've been sitting on it until it's like, no, now it's done. Now I don't, like, because the amount of scrutiny this is going to get is going to be, I don't know, the stuff that you go to sleep crying over. But, you know, it's like, no, this is now. So I think it's, you know, that kind of answers the question, hopefully, where it's like, I'm sure there's a bunch of examples, but you've either done it or you haven't, you know.
I just found it fascinating, not because it's a word, I mean, all social insects have something you can arguably call words, but because it's a word that's understandable across linguistic systems?
Well, yeah, so it'd be like, so one of the nice things about this, so it hasn't been done in birds, but one of the nice things is that if you look, there's been neuro studies done in mammals and, well, humans and bats, and there's this sort of acoustic property called like roughness, which is basically, you know, that like gut-curdling scream when someone's terrified, where like if you hear that, it elicits a physiological fear response, like a fight or flight. This call has those characteristics in it. So like, you know, it'd be, and there is stuff out there when you look at distress calls in birds that within sort of relevant groups, so passerines will tend to respond more to other passerine distress calls than they will to something else. And that's probably because if something's going to be eating a passerine, you know, passerine A, it's probably dangerous to passerine B as well. So I would imagine that it is one of those things where, you know, it's kind of like the most beautiful thing about like behavioural ecology is that you can almost go in with the assumption that nothing's been done and you'll probably be right half the time. So there'd be all these beautiful examples out there, like any scream, any distress call. Like, you know, this call is like for this kind of study, I would make the argument that it's basically the lowest hanging fruit because like the word round like tends to seem the same across languages because it might deliver some very minimal fitness benefit, you know, but non-trivial. Whereas it's like, cool, we're doing something where it's a life or death situation. And guess what, you find that, you know, so it's just kind of like, let's turn the volume up to 11 on the selection pressure and see if we can find it. But yeah, I'm sure there'd be millions of them.
So thank you for your talk. Yeah, very interesting. Many ideas coming and sometimes hard to follow. But I wanted to ask, maybe I was missed, but did you prove any kind of reproductive success or fitness advantage of the birds when they are using this winning call?
Yeah, so previously we've shown that when this call is produced, the birds become more vigilant afterwards, so they become more vigilant around their nests. They also, by mobbing, so in previous work we've shown that when this alarm call is produced, birds come to the nest. Bigger groups of birds which come to the nest are more likely to deter a brood parasite away, and they're less likely to be parasitized. And then I mean, I do have data. I don't know if I'm going to include it because, you know, I was really pedantic about this study and was like, I want to get all of the experiments up to an N of 17 so that it's just pretty across everything. Like, you know, it doesn't actually mean anything, but it's like everything is in its place and it's all pretty. And it's like I've got like 16 or something like that for this one. I don't have it for one of the species, but if you play a scrub wren call to a fairy wren and you have a model cuckoo there versus a different call, they're much more likely to find and respond to the actual model cuckoo. So yeah, like, so there are those, like there's tangible benefits we can talk about, but then also it's really well recognised in these systems that, you know, the ambient perceived risk of parasitism by a bird totally determines how they act over the next couple of weeks or X amount of time. So, you know, if you show, it's in a whole bunch of systems it's been shown that, like, if you show them a cuckoo, their their sensitivity to differences in egg colours and their likelihood to reject an egg goes way up. You know, and same for chicks, and you know, same for the vigilance near the nest. So they sort of, it's all about information, and while that'd be harder to show. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You have shown a study based on a large number of host broad parasite networks compiled across the globe. And you plot some regions and you call them hotspots. Or what you meant was the number of species in those networks, right?
The number of interactions in those networks.
Interactions,
yeah.
Okay. Yes, because I was wondering the kind of, or I would like to know the kind of information that those networks contain.
Yeah, so...
I mean, are they quantitative networks? Have you built the phylogeny of all of them?
We didn't do a phylogeny for this. This was just, so, you know, you might have one parasite parasitizing two hosts, or one host parasitized by two and it would look the same on this map.
So all networks are composed of only a single host and many broad parasites, right?
No. No. So the number of connections this way and this way. So it's like in these areas, you've got a lot of, well, you've actually got a medium number of parasites that are interacting with a lot of hosts. And you know, so it's in both directions. I don't know how to say it properly.
What I mean is, if you compare those networks with plant pollinator networks, for example,
yep.
You can have not only the number of species on each set of species, plant or pollinator, or here, hostes and broad parasites, but also who interact with whom, and what is more important is the interaction strength. Do you have those information?
No, for this we don't. Okay. Because we don't have that because the data isn't good enough for this system. It's a pretty broad brush. Okay. But do you do that stuff?
I've been working on characterizing the structure and dynamics of plant-animal mutualistic networks.
Cool.
So we build a database with a lot of networks, and I remember we don't have many host broad parasite networks in our database. So I was curious about
I can give you
first if those networks are public.
Yeah, we can give it to you, that's no problem.
And also the kind of information that those networks provide. For example, if you have not only who interacts with whom, but also
proportion.
How frequently.
Yeah, no. But we do have that for fishes and anemones. And I would love to talk to you about that because we are trying to figure that out at the moment.
That's very interesting because in this kind of networks, which contrast with the networks among hostes, among pollinators and plants, where you have the frequency of visits.
Yeah.
In this kind of host broad parasite networks, the interactions are really measuring the fitness effect.
Yeah. So
which is very difficult to measure in other kind of networks. But here, if you have how frequently a broad parasite infect each of its hosts, it's a direct measure of fitness.
So all we have for this is there at least one instance of this parasite interacting with this host? There might be one, there might be 10 trillion. But as far as we're concerned, it's exactly the same. However, for the fish, we're just starting a project. This mate of mine, he was like, I've got all this data, I don't know what to do with it, can you sort it out? And he has about 5,500 records of every species of anemone fish, so the true anemone fishes, interacting with hosts for every species of fish and every species of anemone all throughout their distributions. So for what you're talking about, that would be perfect.
Okay, so we can
definitely
talk later.
That'd be rad. And then we could do a comparison with this and the fish. Cool, rad, perfect.
Last opportunity. No? Well, no? Okay. Thank you very much, Will.